Thank you, everybody, for having us here. So between ourselves, we call this this conversation catching up, as in catching up between us, because we actually, well, Joseph and I both live in Milan, but we travel so much, so we see each other quite rarely. Andrea is in Monaco, so in Munich in English, and therefore, and I think the two of them haven't seen each other actually in a while, and we occasionally, let's say, by chance bumped into each other in Venice recently at the Biennale. So that's one side of catching up. We actually also want to tell each other what they're doing, and the other side is actually, since we are going to talk about museums and what's happening currently to the museums, and also what they are doing together with the museums. We know that these institutions are always kind of catching up with the reality now, with the changes that are happening effect of the microphone within the society, politics, economy, and so on. So I would start with the first question. Basically, the work of both of you focuses on either, well, directing institutions or curating exhibitions in museums. And I know that for both of you, the issue of sustainability is actually a really, really important one. And I think you're let's say, working with this issue in very, very unique way. So could you please talk about it, and also expanding on how you think cultural institutions have a critical role in addressing this topic? And maybe I would ask Andrea to actually start.
Okay.
And he has also some slides to show to explain better how he's doing this, so we'll have the screen shared.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to move on the slides. Not a big success so far, but I will immediately catch up. Okay, it was up. Thank you so much. And maybe it's interesting to begin.
Yeah, maybe a brief introduction about Haus Der Kunst.
Oh, okay. Short introduction about Haus Der Kunst. Haus Der Kunst is this institution. You see, it's a very large building. It was constructed between 1934 and 1937, and it's a haunted and also problematic building because it was constructed directly under the directorship, so to say, of Adolf Hitler as the most powerful propaganda institution in Germany. Well, and by propaganda, intending the idea of true art, particularly painting and sculpture, trying to permeate the interiors of all German and, of course, loyal Nazi families. And it ran as a sort of ongoing exhibition that will be updated year by year for between 37 and 44. And eventually, these are first images of that specific moment in time, almost 100 years ago. Eventually, it's been transformed by the, let's say, American forces in a outpost for the American forces, becoming then a museum. This, if you have some familiarity with art, is also the place where the big, which back then was called Große Deutsche Ausstellung, exhibition about German art, was juxtaposed to the historical exhibition Ekaterina Kunst, which actually was presented few meters away from where Haus Der Kunst is. Ekaterina Kunst in English being translated degenerate art. Throughout the years, starting from in 1954, when Guernica was parading Europe as a sign of peace and also reconciliation and acknowledgement of the catastrophe of Second World War, throughout the years, the institution became one of the most relevant contemporary art centers in Europe and also eventually in the world, and was so far run by 3 directors, unfortunately all males, The last one being the trailblazing curator and museum director Okvi Envenzo, the late Okvi Envenzo, who unfortunately passed away in Munich in 2018. This is how the institution looks. I will show some slides later when Ekaterina will ask a specific question, but to answer the question you were mentioning, I will start from the show that is on in this very moment, which is a survey show of Japanese 88 years old artist Fujiko Nakaya, which is technically the first exhibition I created. I'm not creating many exhibitions, but it's technically the beginning of my program, so to say. So this exhibition is part of a program that ideally will be running for the next 4 years. And it's a sort of statement towards how an institution can engage with the question of sustainability. Nothing has traveled, literally nothing has traveled. Everything has been produced in Munich, from the, let's say, the sort of basin with water and the wooden part that enables the fog sculpture to collapse into the water, because the fog has a very specific behavior, and I will speak perhaps maybe about this later, to the actual fog sculpture that are entirely made of water. And that's the reason why we choose this artist, Fujiko Nakaya, because since the early 70s, she's been working, making fog sculptures made entirely of water, not using any chemical, not carbon and so on. And the water comes directly from the Eisbach, which is a small creek, so to say, canal that runs alongside the institution, which is set in a park. So just a little answer among many other on how you can make a survey show, which is not about fog. It's about the practice of an artist been working for 60 years. So there are mostly video works and and also some documents and 3 fog sculptures that somehow states the fact that we do not necessarily need to invest in transportation, in insurances, and we can work locally, which is one of the main questions. Of course, I can't respond for the main issue, which is the institution being finished in 1937 and never have been updated. Amazing outcome, the architecture is very good. Of course, the level of power consumed and dispersion is really high. So we try to keep the consume of power as low as possible, but inevitably we are literally running against the normal standards and parameters of saving by using, for instance, LED lights and so on. But this is a completely different question. So first answer, exhibition making can be different and can be made differently.
So basically, most of the program that you're leading now will be like all the shows will be locally produced.
We're trying to, because there is another option. The option is when you want to work, let's say, objects. It could be painting or could be photographs, for instance. A good option could be, for instance, like working with astonishing local collectors. Every town, every region has fantastic local collectors that you can involve, bring in and show their own collection. Or, as in the case of Fujiko Nakaya, Fujiko was a painter between 1950 and 1960. We literally got everything from her living room. So the 28 paintings in the show come literally from her storage and from her own living room, and were shipped from Tokyo to Munich. So trying to really to save as much as possible and not working on international loans and so on, and making still a relatively good selection. Alongside the show of Fujiko Nakaya, there's a retrospective now of the groundbreaking collective, Japanese collective type. Again, this nothing traveled, it's all video files, so to say, that are set.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe Joseph, you can pick up on this, and also maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about VAC, and I should be looking there, sorry. And also there's something that Andrea mentioned that I think relates to what you might be saying, is this fact that actually this building has lasted for so long without any changes, which in itself already is a quite clear statement on how we should work with architecture, being more sustainable, the fact of duration, right?
Absolutely. No, I really appreciated Andrea's example, because I think it's a really perfect example in that it illustrates the fact that when we talk about these questions of energy, environment, and so on, it's not so much, it's often kind of ends up becoming a rather sterile technical discourse, and I think that that's not an interesting direction. I think the question, and it's also not a useful direction, because it ends up ultimately not necessarily resolving many problems. And I think the Haus Der Kunst is a good example of that, because if you think of this building that's remained the same since 1937 and now is probably by modern standards incredibly inefficient, on the other hand, you have to consider that the fact that nothing has been done to it from 1937 compared to so many other I don't know if you think about Triennale, Milano, all of the times that's been refitted over since it was built, that's another form. Maybe it's, I actually doubt that it's that much more efficient, maybe a little bit more efficient, but all of the refitting, the kind of the habit of continually altering and changing and updating things can actually be really just as damaging or just as harmful. So I think that the point that Andrea was making, which I think is a crucial one, is that it's mostly a question of attitude, a question of how we think about what we are doing. And there's this kind of assumption when you're making an exhibition that you have to bring in all of this stuff and you have to fabricate all of this stuff. And I think what Fujiko Nakawa is capable of doing with this exhibition is to demonstrate that art is something that transcends any specific sort of material practice and is actually a way of looking at the world. And that way of looking at the world doesn't necessarily need a bazillion tons of metal to be shipped around. But anyway, that's just a kind of a reaction to what Andrea was saying. To talk a little bit about what the work that we've been doing on, to kind of respond to your question about sustainability. We recently completed, actually just in February, a year-long research residency at VAC Zattere in Venice, which is an institution that was until recently curated by the lead curator chief curator was Francesco Manacorda. And its main outpost, so to speak, was in Moscow. I say was because obviously things didn't go exactly as planned, and Francesco is no longer the curator, and VAC Zattere, their outpost in Venice, is currently closed, and we had the very good fortune of not having to deal with the consequences of what would have been an incredibly complex situation had the events that are currently unfolding happened sooner. Nevertheless, I think it's that in itself would deserve a certain amount of reflection on the kind of the intricate web that is created between the world of art, the world of architecture, the world of discourse around sustainability and so on. But I don't want to hijack the conversation in that direction. Anyway, Francesco asked us as Space Caviar to come up with a proposal for a year-long program for VAC Zattere to correspond with what was going to be the Architecture Biennale of 2019. As it turned out, of course, 2020, because normally VAC is more devoted to contemporary art, but they also like in Venice to kind of have this dialogue also with architecture. So previously, for example, they had worked with Assemble, which is a kind of a group operating between architecture and art, and they were interested in trying to use their platform in Venice as a space for something a little bit different from a conventional exhibition. And so I said, what would you propose to do in the space if you had 1 year? And our proposal was, and here maybe I can share some slides just to share screen. It's telling me that you cannot share screen while other participant is sharing. So maybe you can turn off
just a second.
your screen sharing, and then I'll turn on.
Let's hope we're going to see.
Any topic that, at least if you're architecture.
Joseph?
Maybe doing sharing the screen.
It's probably his connection.
Maybe
Oh.
while sharing.
All right. So while we're trying to get back, Joseph, I will maybe ask you the next question in the meantime, because I wanted to understand better the consequences of this choice to produce locally everything, because one of the ideas that like that we have about museums is that they also bring art to us. So besides the blockbuster exhibitions that travel around the world and enabling people who cannot really travel to see things maybe in their hometowns. So how does this new paradigm of trying to curate in a way that there's no transport, would that then imply that if I'm talking about more traditional forms of art, like installations, paintings or sculptures, would that imply that then as a kind of backlash, then people have to move more to see things?
It's a very challenging question. I can make an example by answering that. So as you saw, the museum is quite big and it's kind of exactly mirrored, has two equivalent parts. One area has a little bit more museum condition, standards, so to say, the other one doesn't. The other that doesn't was surface is quite impressive. This is big as a 1.5 football field court, and it's not feasible. We use mostly for performances and regularly inviting artists that work with sound. When it goes down to the slightly more traditional media, the decision is always to work with young local artists, who, by the way, are those that local with an international, let's say, potential, right? Work has been dramatically affected by the pandemic because indeed there has been a consequence on artists that might be in the late 80s or mid 80s that won't be able to see their show happening. And I have many examples in mind, international institutions, but those that really lost actually are those that are in between 25-ish, 30, and a little bit more. If they lose 2 years possibility of showing their work, it's really a big issue, and they not necessarily enter the cycle of regenerating and restarting because of the backlog. So to make the example practical, we use that area and we transform it in a permanent workshop. So an artist is invited, in this case it's Jo Penka, and she stayed basically 3 weeks, and she assembled this landscape that then was opened as a sort of catwalk stage for a performance that consisted in sound, bodies, let's say, literally catwalking, and an environment made with relatively poor material, but also quite precious porcelain that are produced in Munich. Munich has a very specific workshop that produces and factory produces porcelain since the 14th century. And that became a show that lasted 1 month. So it's an example. I'm not saying this is the right way, but the example is perhaps what one can do is just transform, like acknowledging the old, let's say, almost old approach steered by the generation of relational artists in the 90s to transform the exhibition site in a production site, in an actual production site. That's a possibility. And then the reach to the audience is very different because it's a basic example, but if you involve the local, wood carver, the local provider, the local, rather than going to those that cost less, but are maybe located in Berlin or in Czech Republic or in Hungary, which was the previous pattern, perhaps it costs a little bit more, and the costs have all skyrocketed since the beginning of COVID. But the degree of affection that you generate, it's totally different because these are workers, families that somehow transmit the message that the institution is involving them and supporting them. And this, for a public institution that is paid by taxpayers, is also somehow, I believe, a mission, right? You have really to give back what you're given. Is Travis back? No.
I'm back now. I'm here, and yeah, it's the strange waves of internet coming and going. But I can show those images if you like of shall I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying what we proposed was in fact a specifically a reflection on the word sustainability, because in a way I think the biggest problem in a way is the word itself, because it carries with it so much baggage and so many sort of preconceived ideas about what it means to be sustainable. And I think that this can become a huge limitation for architects themselves in many instances, and also for institutions. And so I'm going to show this. So the exhibition, in fact, was most largely kind of a reflection on language and how we actually describe what try to be a little bit more specific about what we mean with with sustainability. And so the starting point was actually to, in a way, shift the focus away from whether something is sustainable or not, because that's a very, very vague question. And instead to think about to really kind of shift the discourse onto a question of balances, like how to actually design and how to build in a way that is not that can find an alternative to consumption. And this is, I think, one of the fundamental problems, is that the architects often find themselves in a very awkward position of having to, on the one hand, try to balance a budget sheet that is impossible to balance, because on the one hand it has to be sustainable, and if you really go to the bottom of what sustainability means, it very quickly becomes a definition of actually not consuming anything that can't be replaced, because it doesn't, the planet Earth is a closed system, and as soon as you start using up things that of which there is a limited amount, then at some point, sooner or later, maybe not within our own lifetimes, but at some point that's going to run out. So if you actually begin to kind of take that as a principle of a starting point, and you begin to look for alternatives to an approach that is based on depletion of finite resources, very quickly the kind of it becomes quite simple to understand that in fact it's very much about a question of extraction. Like how can we think about satisfying our needs as individuals, as communities, as societies, without somehow completely devastating something that does not in fact belong to us. And so therefore this idea of extraction was a kind of a starting point to then actually think about that on multiple levels, not just a material sense, like how can we actually design a kind of a landscape, an urban landscape or an extra-urban landscape that is not based on depletion of renewable resources, but how can we also conceive of an architecture that is not somehow inherently dependent on extraction of value from certain either strata of society or certain communities that maybe are elsewhere beyond the horizon that we can't even see, who are essentially paying the price for the way that we build. And of course, the same could be applied to many other fields. So that was how we kind of came up with this idea of non-extractive architecture, and to ask a group of many people over the course of the year. We involved over 40 researchers, some of whom were actually residing with us there. Much of the work was really kind of based on an extremely detailed analysis and kind of breakdown of all of those things that typically are a little bit kind of overlooked due to the sheer complexity of buildings. And this is a picture that I think sums it up very well by Charlotte Malter-Barths, who was also involved in the program in various ways, kind of really deconstructing almost to the kind of atomic level the practice, and then also attempting to kind of build a theoretical or ideological framework around what it means to build non-extractively. And then kind of coming back to what Andrea was just saying now, part of the scope of this project was to only exhibit anything that had been built, that had actually been created inside the palazzo. So the only thing that we proposed to the institution do as a permanent, not permanent, but as a sort of substantial modification of spaces throughout at the beginning, was to build a workshop. And in fact, the project opened to the public with nothing in the building, and everything was built throughout the course of the year and then dismantled throughout the course of the year inside the building. And part of the, we did some pretty insane building work in there, like also completing some really kind of incredibly technical materials and technical processes. A little bit the point being that if you can do this inside the Palazzo in Venice, more or less you can do it anywhere. And so this was, there was also kind of a lot of bringing a lot of collaborations with companies and organizations that are really kind of working on very kind of advanced technologies, both in terms of the production of materials, but also manufacturing processes such as 3D printing. And that was that was really kind of in a way also a reset for our own practice, because a lot of the designs and exhibitions and curatorial projects had been in a way kind of attempting to deal with this problem, but never in such a systematic and complete way. So this was an incredible opportunity, not just to have a year to really spend like thinking about how certain problems can be solved in a fundamentally different way, but also to develop, and I think this is the most important thing, to develop a network of people, which is now really hundreds of people who have shared knowledge and shared approaches to this. So that was just a few words on. Maybe I'll just very quickly, since actually we can come back to it. I have a couple more slides, but we can come back to those afterwards.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and what I find also, well, you almost answered the next question, but I'll ask it anyway in a more explicit way, because both of your work deals with let's say interdisciplinary research and production. You're kind of the museums become less about just pure exhibition making, but about these two other things. And according to you, are there any specific implications of these practices to the spaces of the museum? Well, you already said that even a Venetian palazzo can accommodate it, but in general, would you elaborate a little bit on whether this kind of completely different use of space comparing to what it was conceived for originally, is that like generating any new interesting opportunities, meanings, or
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, I could say that the point of making a laboratory inside the palazzo is an important one, and I think it's like it makes a very visible, almost kind of a rather blunt point. But the most important thing is actually not that. It's not really about, that's kind of a thought, an exercise in practice of how to build things differently. But I think the real exercise is that once you start to think a little bit like Andrea pointed out before with this exhibition, once you start to think to actually pay some attention to these things, the way that you think about the building as an envelope, the institution as an envelope, completely changes, and all sorts of new possibilities are unlocked. And this, I think, is the thing that you mentioned a little bit before. This is kind of something we talked about, how artistic institutions are in a way in desperate need of this, but architecture institutions are even more behind. And I think that this is, again, it's really, I mean, the question of sustainability is super important, but somehow there's a little bit this feeling that, you know, it's this boring thing that we have to deal with, and we have to make these boring exhibitions because, you know, we've got to be polite and good and nice and responsible. But in fact, completely the opposite is true. Like, actually, when you start to think completely differently about the material processes behind exhibition making, and you throw out of the window the whole cartongesso, plasterboard, boring partitions thing, you unlock and you involve artists, and you involve the kind of teams and the local, also, as you were pointing out, the audience you can create a completely different level of engagement. And actually, I was just going to show very briefly a couple of slides. This is absolute, in fact, a complete preview that hasn't been shown anywhere yet of an upcoming project, which is the exhibition design for the upcoming Triennale di Milano, which is opening in July. And which is called Unknown Unknowns, an introduction to mysteries, and curated by Ercilia Vaudo, who's actually an astrophysicist from the European Space Agency. So really dealing with a lot of kind of extraplanetary topics, but also about the kind of existential condition of living right now. And this is just kind of a super sneak preview, but actually what, again, in the spirit of kind of rethinking the process behind how we produce exhibitions, actually the entire display system, and this is a direct consequence of the research we're doing in Venice. This is the Unknown Unknowns Triennale 23esima. It's actually from a presentation we gave this morning, and it was open on Keynote, so I thought maybe we can just show these. This is actually a prototype of one of the displays that we did in Massa Lombardo with a company, 3D Wasp, which is an amazing Italian company that works on architectural scale 3D printing. And this is one of the prototypes of a display system. And this is kind of not officially public yet, so I'm going to stop sharing there. But the point is that once we started to kind of look into the possibilities of actually not bringing anything into the museum and just only using locally available materials and thinking about how we could source everything as close to the site of display as possible, it suddenly unlocked this amazing world of people who are working on precisely this. And so in fact, the display system is going to be 3D printed out of mud, essentially, which is taken from the risaie della pianura padana, bound together with rice, lolla di riso, which is like it's essentially a food byproduct of the food industry that makes that uses rice husks for making risotto, and all of these materials are completely biodegradable, so the whole thing can essentially be ground up and put back into the field, and it's essentially just dry mud. And it unlocks all sorts of also, without giving kind of, you'll see then the exhibition hopefully, but it really is, I think, an opportunity to also really kind of recapture the attention of the public, which I think has become a little bit bored with a certain approach to exhibition making, which is also kind of incredibly wasteful in many ways.
Yes. Andrea, would you add on that? Well, going back to this questioning kind of the container, whether it's suitable, whether using it for showing production or for engaging in production and research works just as well as it worked for exhibitions in case of Haus Der Kunst.
Yeah, totally. Yes, I completely agree, and I really will champion the design for the. I agree with Joseph, and will champion the design for the display design for the next Triennale. It's groundbreaking, and it's going to be definitely enabling everyone to reconsider what does it mean, particularly in a town heavily loaded by the culture of design, as Milan is. Munich is similarly loaded by the culture of design, actually. It's a kind of different design. It's industrial design. It's a design that has to do with three main companies, car companies mostly, BMW on the one hand, other one is the Airbus, the plane companies, and a whole new world of IT. If I can go quickly to the PowerPoint, I will just show, and I go back to the question you asked about the building. Actually, I on purpose started with an image that shows the building from the sky and shows the fact that the building is set in town, but it actually set as the gate between the town and what is the biggest public park in the world after the park, the urban park of Mumbai, that is the English Garden. And this is a perspective that is not known so far. It's just a decision I took to take an image to actually contextualize where the building is. You might be aware that there is a haunting project by David Chipperfield, supposed to happen at some stage soon,
So
to
it
refurbish.
will happen.
Well, I can say something about to refurbish the building, to intervene on the building, to which I am gently in discussion also with Chipperfield, resisting as much as I can by challenging the astonishing possibility the building still has. Because what I didn't say about the fog exhibition is that, let's call it as such, that on the left side of our image now, there is not only this incredible amount of energy with actual surface, there's a wave of natural wave where surface surf all the year into the creek, the canal I was mentioning, but also there is therefore a whole energy that in the museum drops, but also there are doors that I decided to open necessarily to enable the fog to get out. Otherwise, the building will really seriously be affected. But I keep going by presenting this challenging project to demonstrate somehow that this kind of building can be extremely interesting to acknowledge and to welcome forms of art that otherwise wouldn't be acknowledged or wouldn't be, let's say, shown. So there's a whole path that is, as I said, not against the refurbishment, but steering the fact that even when the refurbishment will happen, I suppose not before 28, 29, there will be a reconsideration what a museum would be and what the needs are, what the requests are, and what an air conditioning system is meant, how an air conditioning system is meant to work, whether it can be reversed, whether you can use, as we are using in this moment, exhausted air and not affecting the whole system of the gallery, how you can, instead of building an actual conditioning system, just use the traditional, let's say, Etrusc or Roman conditioning system that are based on holes and the relationship between temperature, the ground, and the height of the building. And all this actually what we are using, no? It's funnily enough in this exhibition. So it's an example I don't even want to make. Like, I come from an institution where I made like press releases on engaging on getting down carbon on the carbon footprint by a certain year in a certain percentage. I think one should even say anything. Just do it. Try to do it. Try to be loyal. Try to be constant, and try to challenge the incredible opportunity that this architecture still give us and needs to be given. And they're not about massive sculpture to be brought in. It's about other forms of art that are fundamental, are shaped us fundamentally, and that can be redesigning also our relationship with a landscape that is not necessarily the urban landscape, as you can see, but it's a totally different landscape that luckily in Munich is so much present. So from Chipperfield, what I completely acknowledged and took into consideration is to switch somehow the main front. So to imagine that despite the entrance not being on the side we see, there's a street in the back, which is the actual front, but being the buildings completely symmetric, who cares about cardinal point in the end? Why should we follow the idea that this works as a church and therefore east and west must be minor entrances and south must be the front entrances? Who says this? So you can really make the building spinning and rotating if you play with art and you commission and produce in a different way. And this goes back to an old project. I had the privilege to work with Joseph, like about, I think, 15 years ago, almost. That was made at the San Siro Stadium just for a design week, and how you can see a very monofocal architecture, let's say, inhabited by a specific entertainment entertainment-oriented gaze, becoming a completely other apparatus.
In fact, I think it's actually very beautiful, almost a political statement that you actually, by simply switching the entrance, which is also now switched towards the park, I mean, this is a very strong statement about how the museum kind of could operate now, or kind of a shift in vision, in mission, in many things.
It came, as if I can add one part, it doesn't come because there's a sort of a specific ecological preoccupation. It came simply from the fact that the park was like, became a crowd in the last year and a half because of COVID. Yeah. So everyone was out there when possible in the park. So it will be stupid to acknowledge the traffic of the car, which is the main entrance, but rather I think it's interesting to engage with those enormous amount of people that just hang out in the park as a first sign of freedom, no?
Yeah, no, super nice. Joseph, you wanted to say something?
No, I absolutely share this idea that institutions sometimes, I think the most powerful way that you can work with the that you can use architecture to enhance an institution is actually by one of the most powerful ways you can use architecture is actually simply to change the program rather than changing the building. And I think that was very powerfully demonstrated in Domus Circular. And I think that the point that you're making is that actually it's, I mean, it kind of goes back to Cedric Price's point about, you know, like, and that we shouldn't be thinking about designing bridges, we should be thinking about how to get to the other side. And sometimes there's this assumption that, you know, architects should be making buildings and curators should be making the art and so on. But I think a curator can also really operate as a very sophisticated level as an architect by simply changing the orientation and rethinking the program, and also determining what activities are happening in what spaces. And that really kind of, I think, is the essence of also kind of, we're in a design school here, and I'm also very much involved with the design school here in the Netherlands, Design Academy Eindhoven. And my sort of standard sermon that my students have now become bored of hearing is the fundamental importance of multidisciplinary practice, and the fundamental importance of schools being places that are magnets rather than tracks, a binary of specialization. It's really kind of the Buckminster Fuller idea of the struggle against specialization. I think schools need to struggle against specialization in order to put out designers who are curious in every possible direction and who have maybe some very specific and deep knowledge, but that are comfortable working in all sorts of branches of the field. And that's what unlocks the possibilities, like what Andrea just described, of completely rethinking an institution without knocking down a single wall or building one.
Which also goes along with the, well, we're also with our students working in an existing building, and I'm also kind of preaching in with other words, but the doing nothing. So try to think what you can do with the building before actually any architectural intervention. So to really think what is the potential of architecture. So yes, I maybe pass to the next topic, which is partially connected, but brings in other issues, and I think it's particularly related to and for me it's super interesting topic related to Haus Der Kunst in particular. So we could say that in the recent decades we're witnessing a pluralization of historical narratives. So once there was a kind of this normative idea of history of art, there was like, it was a kind of linear process where things happened and everybody kind of agreed that that was the official history. But especially after the World War II, after feminism movement, and now all the other kind of post-colonial movement and so on, this canon, this general canon, has collapsed. And both artists and institutions have to reposition themselves in history. They kind of have to rebuild the context in which they have to operate. And therefore, I wanted to ask you how Haus Der Kunst as institution also is responding to this or how is it building its context in which it's operating, like in the historical kind of perspective, given the fact that it has a very complex history, starting with the Nazis and so on. And how do you as a director of that institution doing that?
Well, it's an amazing question. It can be taking a long time to answer. No, it's really fantastic. Thank you for asking that, because this is made it, like, so to say, the sixth mission of the institution. The institution has had this let's say fundamental director that really is the main champion, has been the main champion of post-colonial thoughts in art, and has been working on this topic for about 20 years. And the institution in the last 7 years of Ocrien's leadership became a, let's say, a linchpin of this thinking through exhibition making. I guess the first challenge is, what does it mean to think really out of the box and out of the convention and the, let's say, the keywords that are going to be stereotyping, and then I will be inevitably becoming convention and stereotypes in a few years. So every word that we are dealing with now, be it the end of the Anthropocene or the decolonial, or are going to be heavily loaded works that you need to struggle and dismantle again with the tool of the master, as we all know. So what do? We try to open up completely different trajectories. And we try to, and like this is a good example, the Dam type being acolyte of Fujiko Nakaya, and Castelnicolai as a landscape architect encountering the work of Fujiko Nakaya's father, and becoming an artist inspired by the bridge between Fujiko Nakaya's father, and we say something more, and his background in landscape architect and his passion for Joseph Boy as an early ecologist, and then all this reflecting in a show by Christine Sung Kim, which is at the center of the institution in this moment. What kind of narrative we draw? We draw the narrative that Fujiko Nakaya is not a footstep in the history of Gutai, a fundamental movement of the 50s in Japan. It's not a footstep in the history of Monoha, equally fundamental movement in which she could have been seen as the only woman challenging the heavily loaded sculpture made of copper, bronze, metal, and stones, like although minimal and so much connected to Italian arte povera. She's not a footstep in the history of EAT, where she was actually the Japanese correspondent and the closest friend to Bob Rauschenberg. And she's not an early pioneer of video. Actually, she's an astonishing artist who's been working as an underdog or with a very networked idea of what cooperating means, following completely the legacy of her father, who is perhaps one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, is a person who actually not only realized and synthesized for the first time ever artificial snowflake. So he made snowflakes in laboratory. He's the person who somehow found out that snowflakes have all different shapes, and this had a huge impact in the understanding of physics and mathematics as well, but also founded a groundbreaking film production company that redesigned the idea of the Japanese landscape through 9,000 films between 1944 and 1990s. All this is in the show. What is interesting is, I hope, there are other trajectories that need to be told. And these trajectories can have to do with science and unbox the misunderstanding of someone like Fujiko Nakaya from being a media pioneer, both works being wrong, to someone who has a totally different trajectory, but was impacted and was influenced through her networking way of being actually, way of life, is as relevant as, let's say, a central figure in the movement of Monoha. I took it very long. I'm not sure you all have the references that I'm mentioning because they might be very specifically related to art history. But I believe when looking to the present future, one of the main, let's say, answer is looking to the present past and locating this relevant figure that will have been otherwise outsider or would have been like taken out. And this enables to tell other narratives, and correctly and admirably Joseph mentioned Cedric Price, as we all know, an architect who didn't build so much, but had incredible influence. No? And that influence is still shaping, or not my necessarily thoughts, but the thoughts of so many younger architects and so on. So the mission is trying to get out from the boxes of tagging, like word tagging, and generating other trajectories by towards the public and the audiences, enabling mostly throughout bodily perception and the feeling of space, and less with like wall texts, narrative that are exciting and actually absolutely tuned to the present. Because it's the narrative, I mean, what is the cloud? I mean, the cloud is that thing over there made of data, right? But it's also the cloud of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's also the constantly changing, let's say, temperature and shape element that challenges completely the history of sculpture. So you can say so much about that thing that, as you say, I'm already excited. So I keep it low, but I hope this is a sort of beginning of an answer.
Yeah, it's an amazing answer. And Joseph, what do you think? Because like, I think architectural institutions are lagging even more behind in this. I mean, do you know examples maybe, or in your practice where this kind of construction of alternative narratives has somehow generated more interesting programming? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that the answer, in a way, my sort of attitude is very much the same one as to the question of sustainability. I think the two things are essentially the same question, and in many ways, non-extractive architecture was as much about cultural questions of sort of cultural definition. Who owns our idea of architecture? Who defines what we mean by beautiful? Who gets to kind of establish the canon, as you put it, as about questions of sustainability. And to put it in a very kind of like really in a nutshell, I think the problems are also really the same ones, in the sense that I think there's a perception that we have to do this because it's a sort of a penance, because it's the right thing, but it's a little bit sort of limiting, and it makes everything difficult, and we have to sort of bow our heads to the woke culture of 2022, blah, blah, blah. But I see it completely the other way around. I see it like it's just completely absurd how the history of modern art, the history of modern architecture, the kind of post-industrial, artistic and architectural universes that we've created are essentially kind of tapping into at the very most, perhaps like 12 or 15% of human potential that's available, by excluding everybody who is essentially not a sort of middle to elderly aged white man. And if you think about all of the possibility, the suppressed potential in the women who are not given a voice, in the minorities who are not given a voice, in the maybe queer communities who are not given a voice, and so on, it's just kind of, it's a little bit like the that thought exercise of what would the world be like today if Hitler hadn't succeeded in coming to power and eliminating like such a vast swathe of European intelligentsia. I mean, probably there'd be operas and films and books and compositions that we'll never hear because they were eliminated. And in this case, it's kind of even more absurd, because we somehow don't even understand that this has been, that we're just not taking advantage of the incredible potential that's out there. And there's a sort of perception that, oh my God, if we get more women in the institutions and more minorities, it's going to be the downfall of white men like me. It just doesn't, that's not how it works. There's not like some sort of finite amount of creativity that we can achieve. It's like there's space for everybody to be creative. So I think that the first thing that we need to do as kind of in terms of kind of bringing this back to institutional practice is to offer demonstrations of this, to show how to kind of offer concrete examples of potential unlocked, and to introduce the idea that there really is space for everybody, and that this is one of the, and that this is going to then have a kind of a knock-on effect on many other dimensions of society. And so therefore, I think kind of going, the institution has a role in a way of a sandbox or a kind of a micro laboratory of society in which we can experiment with so many things, from material flows, like we were talking about before, like local production, to thinking about how we can kind of work on a completely different understanding of the economies and involvement of the local communities in programming and in production and so on. And then all the way through to this idea of unlocking potential that will then also have a huge impact on the economic level. Once we actually kind of show in the sort of space of institutional practice that there's so much wealth of knowledge and amazing ideas to be tapped into.
Thank you for this last contribution. Your vast knowledge and your experiences certainly are inspiration for our students, and I'm sure they will also be following what your work, your contemporary work, and what you'll be doing in the future. So thank you very much. Just touching on one thing that Joseph brought up about what he tells his students in Eindhoven about the conception of what a school should be, that of being an open space and of collaboration with aggregation. Also here at Domus, we have a similar approach where we like to think of the school as a container that's permeable. And tonight was a perfect example of that permeability, where we have special guests coming in and sharing incredible knowledge, incredible experience. So thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Ekaterina, and thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.